Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of MEDtalkx Book Club Off the Shelf. It's just gone 8:30 p.m. in the UK. It's the 30th of August, 2020. And for those of you listening and watching from the UK, I hope you're having a good bank holiday. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my fellow co-hosts today. I've got Dr. Mehran Javed.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks for introducing me, Fahim.
Dr. Zubair Patel.
Good evening, everybody.
We've got Mebs as well, who's a retired police officer, and he's a guest for tonight's show. Welcome, Mebs.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone.
And my name's Fahim Shakur. So over the course of just under an hour, we hope to dissect the book, The Namesake, a very widely known book by the Pulitzer award-winning author Jhumpa Lahiri. For those of you who haven't read it, hopefully by the end of the evening, you'll either decide to or decide not to perhaps read the book. Usual things are that we actually try and go through different parts of the book, the themes, and explain a little bit about what the book means to all of us as well. It's usually something that we try to do is also explain a little about the author. So this author, although I did say is well known, for those of you who don't know her, Jhumpa Lahiri is an American author known for her short stories, novels, and essays in English, and more recently in Italian. We'll come back to that Italian theme a bit later on. She debuted with The Interpreter of Maladies in 1999 and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And then her first novel, the one we're discussing tonight, is The Namesake from 2003. And it was adapted into a popular film of the same name as well, starring Irfan Khan and Kal Penn and Taboo, amongst other artists and actors and actresses. And that came out about 2006, 2007, which is quite quick after publication of a book to much critical acclaim. To give you a bit of a synopsis of the book, this book is about an Indian family, and specifically a Bengali family. Bengal, for those of you unaware, is a part that encompasses Bangladesh and India, West Bengal and East Bengal respectively, and is where has its own identity in terms of language, food, traditions. And we'll come on to that, and you'll see why that's important during the discussion tonight. It talks about a book of actually the main protagonist is a person called Gogol or Nikhil or Nick, so many different names that he has during the course of the book. Gogol is what we call in Bengali the Daknam, or the nickname that's been given to him. And then it goes on to obviously him changing it just at the time of college to Nikhil, and also later to the anglicized form of Nick to try and gain acceptance with the community at large in the USA. There's also a sister, Sonia, as well, who's a few years younger, although she has a fairly minor role, I would say, in terms of some of the other characters. But she does come up at certain occasions, for instance, the death of his father and a few other times as well, and does raise her head. His parents have a large role in the actual book. So we've got Ashok Ganguly and Ashima Ganguly. Ashok is a professor in Boston. He actually comes to MIT first of all and teaches there, and then works up his way in the academic ladder and actually settles down. They have 2 children in the USA. The brief story about him and his wife, Nikhil or Gagol's mother, is that they actually had an arranged marriage in Kolkata in India. And then after the marriage, they both set away and came to America together and made their life overseas. I guess in some ways it's the typical American dream, Indian immigration story, whatever you want to call it. There's so many ways to look at this. And so they're first generation immigrants, as they don't have any predecessors who are actually residing in the USA. The narrative then moves after relocation, early life as a couple, then the 2 children. And then, as I said, the main protagonist then comes in, which is their eldest son. And a lot of the book then revolves around him, his excursions, and what he does and the way he looks at life. So it talks about the way he actually studies. So he goes to very good schools in the USA, and then he goes on and does architecture. It goes on, it talks about his romantic liaisons during the course of life, ill-fated, I should say, and short-lived, but liaisons nevertheless, sometimes in a bit of explicit detail, I have to say. Perhaps we can actually touch on that during the evening. There's also something where there's a concept of his marriage, which comes in at the latter part of the book, along with the death of his father, a pivotal moment in the book, and one that really something that it's true the character really struggles to reconcile with. He really struggles to actually find his place in the world, and he really changes his priorities and what life means to him after the death of his father. It really hits him hard, and it leads to the breakdown of one of his relationships at the time, and then he moves on to an arranged marriage after that, which is quite interesting. I think there's so many things in this book to explore. I've tried to give you a bit of a gist, as I don't want to take away the limelight. There's so much I want to hear from the other guests on tonight. But we did have a discussion a week ago, as we normally do prior to these meetings, and we talked about things like culture came up, identity in terms of name and what that means as part of your identity, and what other things are part of someone's identity, the concept of love and marriage. Are they the same thing or not? Also about explicit nature of things that can happen in some of the sensual, I would say, sexual scenes in the book as well. We talked about nostalgia, alienation, immigration. And it's quite topical, actually, talking about immigration, seeing as what's happening in the UK in terms of immigration, some of the laws changing soon in terms of who can come and not, how much money they need. And so it's quite topical even now. And it is a book of our times, which, interestingly, I don't always agree with the Daily Mail, but that's how they describe this book, a book of our times. And I would agree with that. I'd concur with that. Assimilation and accommodation are themes as well. To what extent do you try and ingratiate yourself with the host community, to put it in polite terms, and to what extent do you not, and retain your identity and keep that? These are themes which are, I would say, universal and lifelong themes which many of us can relate to, not just those of us from an ethnic minority, but just any immigrant and anyone who's new to a different place. The concept of death, how we all grieve, is different to everyone. In the book, there's the serious portrayal of Hindu grief, particularly, I would say, in terms of how the elder son shaves all of his hair, and then actually the rites, obviously burning the ashes and going to the Ganges and spraying that. These are all obviously well known in Hindu tradition. There's also the relationship that comes and goes, his constant toing and froing of relationships, who he wants to have close in his family, his inner circle, and then who he brings out, and then who he brings back in, and learning from different generations. So we'll be talking about the different generations who are there. Obviously, he's got his parents he can learn from, but then also one of his girlfriend's parents he seems to learn quite a lot from, including Italian food, it seems, amongst other things. And then obviously there were quotable quotes, and I think that's always good. So I've summarized a little bit about the book, the author, just to actually set the scene for everyone listening and watching who's never heard of the book. And I'm now going to give way to Mehran to continue tonight's talk about what you made of the book, Mehran.
Thank you, Fahim. And I guess I'm the younger of the other two co-hosts, but thank you. No, it's as you rightly said, Jhumpa Lahiri, she was born in 1967. Her previous collection was an assortment of short stories released in 1999, and then ended up getting the Pulitzer Prize in the year 2000. But obviously this Namesake was her first novel, and it was something that I was actually looking forward to, just because of the fact that I think she struggled with in terms of the main character, Gogol, or Nikhil. He struggled with identity and the whole migration process. So the whole internal dynamic as well as the outward dynamic, how did he reconcile the two? It's interesting. If I listen to what Jhumpa talks about now, she says that it's hard to think of herself as an American. At the same time, she's not an Indian, a place where I was not born, because she was born in London, of all places, and a place where she never lived. So there's clearly lots of themes about cultural heritage, as well as how you adapt. And I think we will touch on some of those processes, such as assimilation as well as accommodation. But it was quite an interesting book. It did feel as though there was detail that was unnecessary at times, but at the same time, it felt it was, the detail was quite spot on. So it was an enjoyable read. It's very simple in terms of the way it narrates, and it did have quite a few quotes. The quote that stands out for me, it's easier to surrender to confinement, but then, we will talk a little bit about what quotes mean. But that's kind of my understanding of the book. But obviously for him, you've given a good 6-minute spiel on the book, so there's very little I can add further to that as an overview. So
okay. Thanks, Mehran. Zubair, I'll come to you now. Then, can you give us some brief thoughts on what you made of the book?
Yeah, thanks for him as always. Lovely introduction to the book, and I could understand when I read the book how maybe it was quite important to you in many ways in terms of when you were growing up and even to this day. I think she writes really well. You can go on along with on the journey that Gogol goes through, that his father goes through, even Sonia at some stage, and you do develop a level of empathy towards Gogol. You do develop an appreciation of where he's coming from in the book in many ways. And there's an element within the book where I remember when I was first reading it, I thought, is this actually factual? Because when I first read it, I thought, this actually sounds quite real. I can actually believe somebody going through this. Until the train scene, I thought that sounds a bit far-fetched. But until then, you kind of thought, actually, there's parts of this that actually are quite believable. And even when his journeys in America occur, although it's rather embellished, you can see individuals that may well have gone through that process, whether it's just in terms of just work, whether it's in terms of relationships, or other aspects too. I love the way she brings in elements in terms of real life elements such as death or birth and marriages, and tries to bring those things that maybe everybody can relate to, because everybody has an element of understanding in terms of cross culture with regards to birth, with regards to marriage, with regards to deaths, and everybody approaches those differently. And I think that kind of helps people to appreciate Gogol's grief over his father, because maybe somebody has lost somebody, and losing somebody isn't just limited to Bengali immigrants to America. It's occurs to everybody throughout the world. So I think that really helps, I think, any individual who read the book to kind of empathize with him. There are parts of it where I thought were quite tragic. I think towards the end, I felt a bit sorry for him. Sat there on his own. There's a house full of people, but I just got the impression that there wasn't the love there anymore for those people. That although they were downstairs, he just rather reminisce about his father and connect with his dad again. But the tragedy was his father was no longer there. He'd obviously long gone. And even though his father tried to reach out to him, I guess through the book, at the time when his father was there, he hadn't really used the book to kind of connect back with him. I love her description of food. Obviously, we all love our food here, so I think I just love the fact that she kind of brings so many different cultural references towards that. I mean, a lot of the things I learned about Bengali culture from her were things I've not come across before. So for him, shame on you for that. But there was a lot of things there that she brought, and I thought, I've not heard of that before. Didn't know about this. I didn't know about the whole nickname thing or the sort of informal name element. But when I read the book, when I've been to your place, I could see part of that too. So I could see some things within her book where I thought, I've seen this at, the Shakurs. I can see this in Fahim's dad or whatever. And that was quite nice. I thought that was quite touching for me personally on that level. And I just loved the fact that she was brave enough to have written the book. I think some people could have been in a position where they thought, well, I was born in London. I've been in the States. My parents come from another part of the world. I'm now living in Italy, but I guess she wrote the book before she moved to Italy. But she had the sort of bravery to do that. And I think hopefully that inspires others also who maybe feel as though they may have a story to tell, or actually do have a story to tell, or have ideas. And I think some of those in this group as well. But gives them the courage to actually say, I'll put pen to paper and I'll go for it. And it might be that, it might inspire somebody. It might be just one individual. It might be it might sort of help others to understand their journeys in other ways. But I think that really helps. I think having people like her writing these books really do help others come forward in sharing their journey and their stories. So that was my take on it.
Excellent. Thanks, Zubair. Coming on to Mebs. Mebs, welcome for coming on the show. Can we get your thoughts on what you made of the book?
Yeah, I think that a lot of you have said. I mean, it is a really good insight to the Bengali culture for me, and I found that really interesting. It's one of the first books that I have actually read on sort of like the Indian subcontinent and the various cultures within the subcontinent, and sort of like the journey that the first generation immigrants from that area take to America, some of their challenges and some of the issues that they face. I did find some aspects of it lacking in detail, particularly around Gogol and some of the. I would have thought that he would have had a lot more turmoil and conflict going on with his mind, and I do, and whether it's because perhaps I've actually forgotten what I've read, but I didn't find that there was enough of that. I think somebody in that position would probably go through those things, and they would play a large part in his growing up and in his life. I found him sort of like adjusting to the indigenous lifestyle too readily, too quickly, too easily. Again, I don't know whether that was delivered by the author, perhaps based on some of the author's experiences. But, you know, we can have all these different takes on perhaps people's experiences, and they write as they experience. So there were some of the things that perhaps I found that you know lacked depth and detail. But nevertheless, really found it interesting, enjoyable, and it has sort of like sparked the desire to read more in me.
Excellent, good. I'm glad we've all had a chance to actually talk about parts of the book. We normally have a bit of structure to these evenings at actual discussion points. So to actually go through some of them, we do share a PowerPoint beforehand. So I'm going to go through that with everyone as we do have plenty of time. What did you like best about the book, and what did you like least about the book? Let's keep going around again. Mehran?
I thought the bit where I really connected with the book was actually the way she described Gogol's father passing. I thought it was very vivid. It's quite tragic, really. The way it was, you know, almost as though he left in a very empty environment, and that must be quite difficult for someone who's been working away from family. How he had never actually perhaps thought about utilizing his environment to at least resemble home, because he always felt home was something far away. So I thought the way she kind of encapsulates the whole event of his father passing, I thought was quite powerful. To say that was the best bit, it's almost difficult to say, but in terms of how a writer vividly captures an event, I thought that was very well done. The least liked bit, I thought it was just the relationships. It was very, as soon as they come in, they just disappear. There was no real, at times reflection about relationships that are broken down as to the reasons why. I found some of the girlfriends or partners that he chose resembled one another. So it almost felt at times it was just unnecessary. It just almost felt as it was just a short story, something she's very used to, just elongated over a larger number of pages. So that's probably what I'd say the least fun bit, and certainly not something I'd recommend my dad anyway.
Zubair, what would you say the best part and worst parts of the book for you?
I think given the name of the book was The Namesake, I'd have to just drill it down to just the name Gogol. I just love that name. I won't use it for my kids, don't get me wrong, but I just love the fact that there's somebody out there who named their child after a literary figure that was completely displaced from their traditional culture. I know we've talked about previously about the link between the Bengali and Russian culture last week, and the fact that there are links there, whether they be sort of via universities and that sort of thing, but also culturally too. But I'd never come across anything before, and I've never read Russian literature. So although there are massive pieces there that, from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, etc., but I've never read Russian literature. So I just thought, because I thought The Namesake there'd be a name that may be something like, I don't know, Ashima or other Bungalians I've heard before, that are, whether they be of either faith, but it was Gogol, and I thought, where does that come from? And I would have thought there'd be something that was very Bengali, basically, but the fact that she chose a name that wasn't actually anywhere from the subcontinent, but really far north, and wasn't even American either, but was still Eastern, because Russia, if you want to call it, it is a bit of an Eastern nation. It came from there. So I just love the fact that she chose that name for the namesake. But I then also love the fact that the name that he had, the way it changed, so from Gogol to Nikhil and vice versa, and his journey towards appreciating that name. So that was for me the best part in many ways. I think we've all talked about the fact that the relationship with the characters, besides Gogol, you couldn't really figure them out. Sonia and the others. And I think I would probably concur with that maybe there was a great deal of what's happening here really with regards to the other people around Gogol and what is their relationship towards him. I would have liked it to actually get more of their input with regards to the name itself, though, or in terms of their input into the Gogol name, because we had the dad's input and the stranger on the train and that sort of thing, and his grandfather's input. But what did his mum think of it? What did his sister think of it? What did they think of it? And when he was sort of growing up, what did his uncles and aunts think of it, so to speak? And I think I would have liked to have that input from her in terms of details from other individuals. But yeah, I think that would be my part of in terms of best and least part of the book.
I take it as that.
Yeah, go ahead, Mebs. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think for me, the best bit was actually learning about the Bengali culture. Although I have to say that it still lacked enough detail about the culture and the various aspects of the culture. And as far as like the least favorite. I think I mentioned this before, actually, that for me, the book actually lacked detail on perhaps the many struggles that first generation migrants had when they went to America or came across to the West. I think there was a little bit about Ashima and Ashok, but not enough for me, because I think that is the aspect that's missing for subsequent generations. I think they need to learn a lot more about some of those challenges and issues that generation faced. And I think it's an important aspect that was missing for me, or not enough of it.
Mm. I'll give a few words myself about what I enjoyed. Obviously, talking about the Bengali culture in such an important book. This is now widely obtainable to masses, millions of people out there. So the Bengali culture is well imprinted into many people's consciousness through this book, I would say. So that was good, the way, she was describing cultural habits like getting all the presents ready for your relatives. I can remember those days, when you go getting ready on the plane and doing all of these things. And so they're all very relatable and enjoyable to see that it wasn't just me, even though it's a fictitious book. I'm sure many households who are part of the diaspora who kept going back and forward to country of origin would also know about these feelings and explaining about some of the cultural things in Bengali culture. Obviously, the nickname, although I didn't have one, and many of my relatives have it. It's interesting to see that in print and what that's like. In the inverse way, the worst thing is also about that as well, because I think it identifies a lot with almost assuming all Bengalis are Hindus, I would say. You don't actually read or hear much about the Muslim voice of Bengal. And there are obviously millions of Bengalis who are Muslim, because you're almost taking the puja, all of these ceremonies are given out as a standard thing without examination. Well, actually, that's a sub-minority who actually don't do that. It's like almost explaining everyone in India is Hindu and there's no Muslims. I'm sure a lot of Muslims would feel aggrieved by that. Yes, they're the majority, but they're not, you don't, and in that way, that clash is still happening at this day again at the moment. So whether it was subconscious, conscious, I don't know, but it did come across as whitewashing a lot of other experiences. For instance, as I said earlier, like, the shaving off the hair, she describes it as a Bengali tradition. That's actually a Hindu tradition, not a Bengali tradition. They're not synonymous. So at times, even though she's very articulate, very sophisticated, I like hearing about all the Italian food. It kind of gives you the reason why she went to Italy. It's interspersed in the book. Italian food is so good, Italian culture, everything, she ends up in Italy. So obviously you can tell a lot about the author. And I liked when she gave away parts about herself in the book. For instance, things like this, and whether she identifies a bit with Mushima and herself, it's not known how much the author identifies more with the mother of Nikhil, or actually, you know, the ex-wife at the end, and that's left open for us to interpret. So there's a lot to enjoy there in, you know, just under 300 pages. But obviously, it's not a perfect book, but which book is, so there are some things to tease out. Good. At least we talked about some things that we enjoyed, some that we didn't. Next question I put on was about learning points from the book. I think that's a good thing, really, because we are doing this book club every month, and it's good because we're reading stuff. But are there stuff that we took away, we learned from this? Mehran, did you learn anything from the book?
I was actually just going to go to your previous comment, Fahim. You talked about Bengali tradition. I struggled to see what was Bengali because I guess I've lived in India for a bit. And I thought most of it, and it's interesting because presuming Zubair, I don't think you've lived in India, and Mebs certainly not. Yeah, but it's but I really did struggle.
I should have said.
Yeah. But it's
just to confuse you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Mebs. I really struggled to see where the you know, that I could actually, it's interesting that Zubair could see that in your family, Fahim, but I really struggled to see that in your family. And maybe that can be talked about outside this book. But no, I guess coming back to your, you know, the learning points, I think it's a struggle for someone to migrate. The concept of heritage and bringing that over is important to someone. I guess in this context, it's very much important to Gogol's parents, but for some reason, he was either disillusioned or he was never taught the importance of it. And almost his relationship with his father was quite distant. And the only time they reconnected was where he had perhaps time to reflect, time to, I think he may have found those feelings of guilt or regret. And I think that's when he very much focused on his dad and what the book meant. So I was just frustrated. At some point, I was hoping that his dad actually just told him why he was named Gogol and why it was important to him. Because the reason that was important to him was everything that came after that train accident was about, you know, a source of happiness, and Gogol was very much part of that. I just felt it was a very much missed opportunity, and the importance of, I guess, parents and children's relationships. So that was the key learning point for me.
Is there anything that people can learn from this book?
I think there's a lot to learn, isn't there, from any book? For me, what did I take from it in terms of learnings? I think, first of all, it would be a case of don't always assume, because when I read the book, I could see Ashok and Ashmina's journey, and I could understand that because I could see the whole Bengali in America and still having that sort of Bengali connection and sort of translating the culture from Bangladesh to the States and holding on to it firmly, going back there every year, seeing relatives, meeting people that were local who were all Bangladeshi and catching up with them a lot. But then with the children, it was as though what's happened here, and I, at times there were plot twists. I wouldn't say, don't get me wrong, but at times I thought, oh, that surprised me. I didn't quite see that. I didn't quite see that happening in Gogol's life. For example, initially when he meets his initial his sort of long-term relationship initially, where they sort of when his father passes away, and he has that, and they have those table conversations, but part of the discussions there that they had on the table, and you could see his sort of desire to belong to America compared to Bangladesh during those conversations, and he was saying he was free and that sort of thing. But at the same time, after that, him then going with Mushima, I thought, where's that come from? And that kind of surprised me. But then she goes off, because when he got with Mushima, I thought that this is it now. He's going to be with her, and they're going to have kids and that sort of thing. But then that kind of didn't quite work out. But I think probably the learning thing would be that every migrant journey is different, and every son of or children of immigrant journey is different is also different, whether they're from the subcontinent to other parts of the world. And I guess what I would take from it is that do not assume that every migrant has the same journey, because my parents' journey was very different to the Ganggulis. I'm sure yours would probably be different too. And my journey as a son of immigrants is different too, but might not be different to others. And I think that's important. I think one thing you kind of get from the book is trying to humanize migrants and humanize the children of immigrants, that we're not a homogeneous group. There's a huge depth of variety, and everybody is different. So I think that for me would be the sort of learning point in terms of don't assume too much from what you see. So it's not a homogeneous group in many ways. And I guess you mentioning there about the whole Bengali thing, and you picking it up, and it's true. Obviously, we just kind of went with it, but obviously it touched a chord with you, and you were quite quick to flag it up. But there's lots of that out there where we see things and we think, well, actually, that's maybe true for that individual or maybe for that family, but actually doesn't quite translate to others.
Mebs, anything that you learned from the book that you want to share with the audience?
Well, at my age, well, I think I just want to say, like, really touch upon perhaps a little bit what Mehran said about sort of the father and son relationship. And the learning point for me was what I was actually missing. And that was the real relationship between father and son. It just didn't seem to exist at all. And particularly, any kind of communication. There was no sort of like words of advice. There's no encouragement. There's nothing that seemed to come or exist in that relationship at all. It was, as Mehran said, it's totally distant. His father is sort of like, he's not as if he's not educated. He's a professor. He's a professor over in America. So you would maybe assume that actually he knows that it will be important for his son to be aware of lots of different things and challenges that he might face. Perhaps even, talking about this identity and belonging stuff, and may be able to have that conversation. But that, I don't think it was touched on at all, about not having those discussions or even talked about. And whether that was deliberate, I don't know, because it seemed as if the parents' existence in lots of ways was completely separate, to the daughter and son, and particularly because the main character was a son. His sort of like main emphasis was on what's happening in America. How am I going to fit in? What relationships do I want? What can I make of myself? And not necessarily saying that those are wrong things, but when you're talking about different cultures, I think that there needs to be some sort of connection to sort of like, so the reader can actually go from one to the other with that adjustment to say, well, yeah, that makes sense. We can follow what's happening, why it's happening, and why there is that disconnect.
That's good. In terms of what I found about learning points, I think there's a lot there for people who haven't maybe been to New York and Boston. They'll recognize places from it. They'll learn more about it. Penn Station comes up in so many famous landmarks of both cities. And also the things that I learned personally is the way that she really takes a lot of detail in actually describing the physical characteristics of things, whether that's places or people, the way she actually takes the care and attention to that. I haven't seen that in many authors, the way she uses the words to describe that. I think it will go down in history as one of those books where people will be able to quote the way that she describes people in this book. There's some really good expressions that she uses. I think people can learn a bit about, I would say, Indian culture, to say what Mehran was saying. Yeah, some of it may not be specifically Bengali, but it's interesting, people will be actually learning about trying to find out more about Bengali culture, because they might get juxtaposed in the idea, well, is this Indian? Is it Bangladeshi? Is it Bengali? Because Bangladesh is a bit of a footnote in this. I think there's a taxi driver, isn't there, who's Bangladeshi, and he's mentioned. and not that there aren't many taxi drivers in New York, there are, but is that the way you want to portray Bangladesh, when really Bengali is perhaps more in common with Bangladesh than the rest of India, especially if they've got a shared language? So I thought that was interesting to learn, that the author just wanted to do that in that way, because many relatives do have, actually relatives on both sides of the border of India and Bangladesh. So I thought that was interesting, and just things to learn, like Dum Dum Airport, in Kolkata and so on. If you've never been to India and these sort of places, then it gives you an insight into India culture. And also it talks about the failed marriage, or the fiance of his wife. They were going to go on the Palace of Wheels, but I don't know if any of you know, but Palace of Wheels is a famous train journey in India. So yeah, I mean, that's like a 5-star hotel that you can actually go around all of India. I wanted to go on this myself a lot. So, when I saw that come out, I thought, yes, that's a good trip. So there's certain little nuggets in the book for those people who are looking out for them. But again, she doesn't always explain them all, but if you know, as the phrase goes. Okay, a bit more. Let's move on. Time is obviously against us as always. How do you think the concept of love and marriage was explored in the book? I think this is a big theme in the book. That's why I brought it out as a question. Mehran, love and marriage.
Well, where do you start on this? As I said, it's interesting how we all thought the last relationship with Mishima was something that that there were cultural similarities. There was from that heritage, you thought all the foundations were there, but nevertheless, I think Mishima as well as Gogol were still kind of trying to identify themselves. I think they were still trying to explore, and it was evident that the marriage broke down very quickly. Now the thing that gets to me is why does a marriage fail? And I don't think we could get a whole amount of reason as to why that failed. But we do know how it can be difficult. Marriage has to be built on compromise. Marriage has to be built on understanding. I didn't feel that a great deal of the actual relationship came out in the book, and perhaps that was the reason why. A lot of Gogol's family were, especially his father, was away from home for long periods of time, for months, in terms of pursuing his career. But what did that mean to his relationship? So there's obviously that cultural acceptance of perhaps marriage is lifelong, and you bear with it. You look at perhaps stability as opposed to happiness, and sometimes the happiness can suddenly become unhappy for various reasons, and that may be the reason why marriages break, or you think the grass is greener on the other side. So some of those kind of concepts comes out in the book. But it's certainly not a very good proponent of marriage or how to build a stable marriage anyway, as well as stability in love.
Zubair, what did you draw from marriage and love in this book?
Interesting. It's definitely not a marriage guide, is it? Quite clearly. I don't feel any further wise with regards to how to build a successful marriage from reading the book. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously for me, the case of, well, look at Gogol and Sonia, because they are the children of immigrants. So that's going to be, for some of us, the sort of level of sort of empathy towards who we kind of relate to most in terms of the actual protagonist here. And obviously from them, you've got Gogol's, she mentions 2 of his major relationships. One obviously isn't marriage, but is a stable long-term relationship which falls apart due to issues around grief and sort of issues where she doesn't feel part of certain parts of his culture, if you want to call it that. And then the other individual is the same, if you want to call it that, in terms of cultural background, in terms of so there's an upbringing within the States in terms of education level, etc. But that one doesn't work out because she has other interests. And it's interesting because you can hear his sort of being upset with regards to when they're in Paris, and you can feel that disconnect where he just feels as though he's not part of her life. But then when they go back, and then when she's aware of it, though, she says, well, there you go, there's a map. And that was interesting because I thought, well, there was a communication there. He's sort of saying, I don't feel part of, your journey here. But if you told her from the beginning, maybe she would have said to him, look, that's fine. Why don't we do this? We'll do this together. You do that on your own. Let's do that. And maybe there could have been that. But that kind of told me that maybe the rapport between them wasn't that great. And maybe they weren't communicating as well. So I guess if you're taking out nuggets, you probably say, well, communication between individuals when they're married, maybe that's from there. But then again, Mishima, her first fiance, doesn't work out. They've got all the gifts as well, but still doesn't work out. The only one who does sort of work out is Anya, I believe, because she's still married, but we don't know a great deal about her, do we? Because there wasn't a great deal of information there. So in terms of, for me, I think you kind of get the impression when you read the book that he's basically saying to individuals that maybe are first generation settlers or immigrants, or whatever the term is, that maybe actually it's not easy. And whether you choose somebody who is culturally alike or dissimilar or whatever, it might fail, it might succeed, but in general it fails, because out of all those relationships, if we're just being statistical about it, 4 failed and 1 passed. But the one we knew that passed we didn't quite know much about it. And Mehran, you mentioned quite clearly there with regards to the parents, the whole thing about, there was an element of dad not being there and there being the separation, and he has to go away. But even then, the bond was still strong. And I guess, is it a case of acceptance? I know when you talk to my parents nowadays and their generation, they'd always say that our generation doesn't quite value marriage as much as they used to. So that is a comment that I hear from sort of my parents and their generation here. Whether that's the case in other cultures that have migrated to the States or to Britain, I don't know. But obviously, I just know from that area that there is that element. So I don't think it's a marriage guide whatsoever. I wouldn't read the book and think how to make your marriage work if you're living in America or Britain and you've come from the subcontinent. I don't think that's going to help. But I think what it does do is give an honest account and basically say that actually things don't quite work out the way you think they will do. And it can be messy. And you might find that success may not come easily. And I think that was a bit sad to take out of it, because I just thought, well, that doesn't really give a positive message. But I don't know whether that's a reflection of her own journey or whether that's actually a reflection of the wider concerns that maybe those that have come from Bangladesh in America find themselves in, or Calcutta rather, find themselves in the States. So I don't know, open to interpretation. But yeah, it was interesting that you mentioned that anyway for him in terms of love and marriage. It's not a marriage guide.
I agree with you. It's not a marriage. Sometimes you can learn from things which go wrong more as well as things that go right, I guess. So on that note, obviously love and marriage, they're big themes. It's almost like 4 weddings and a funeral, this book, isn't it? Except 4 marriages and a funeral. So do you want to say, Mebs, as to what you made of love and marriage as a concept in the book?
Yeah, I think everybody reads, whether it's they read in a book or whether they see a film or whether they see something, they're seeing things through the lens of their own eyes. And for me, I think, to be perfectly honest, I found it very weak on love and marriage. I don't think there was enough issues explored about love. What does it mean? What is it? And through the different cultures as well. And as far as the marriage is concerned, I mean, yes, there was such like the parents' arranged marriage. I'm not sure, again, that there was enough detail around that so that people understand how and why arranged marriages take place in certain cultures. And as far as sort of like, Gogol's marriage is concerned, it kind of falls into it for me, to be perfectly honest, with this, Mashumi, a family friend, if I'm right,
Yeah.
and perhaps on the rebound of failed relationships. So for me, though, both areas lacked quite a lot of detail and exploration. Perhaps being, maybe harsh on the author, because I suppose it is a fictional book rather than as people mention, it's not a marriage guidance at all. It is a fictional book, and perhaps touches on the parts that were maybe key in maybe the author's journey in some aspect. So I suppose there is that element to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought love and marriage is the big themes in the book. They keep coming out. Obviously, you've got Gogol's almost countless failed relationships. And I think to what Mehran alluded to earlier, there wasn't perhaps enough dissection of that or reflection, which might have helped him in his marriage, perhaps. And that's something perhaps someone can look into. And even the concept of communication, I think, Zubair, that you raised, that was important. But also maybe just trying to learn from his parents' marriage that worked. I mean, that would have been an interesting thing. Gogol could have just thought, well, my parents came, they hardly met each other, maybe once just before the marriage. That worked. It's a positive spin to the arranged marriage thing, I would say, in many ways. But in fact, that's not actually what he wanted to do at any stage unsuccessfully. So I thought there were some things that could have been learned from that if he looked. And even when they look into their parents' marriage, even though it's short on detail, it does mention that his father would come home early sometimes. So he may not bring flowers every time, but he had his own version of romance in a degree, didn't he, that he was trying to do, surprising his wife and so on. And it's quite clear they had quite strict gender-defined roles, I think, in their marriage, it's fair to say, in terms of the household responsibilities all lie with her, and he goes and is the breadwinner, and it shows that society, and it works. It's just a form of marriage, but it does show what can actually be out there and something for people to learn about. And also the marriage, I think, in contrast with one of his ex-girlfriend, Maxine's, and he shows how he really looks up to their marriage of their parents, and what he was learning in them, really enjoying, and the overt expressions of affection, which he didn't see in his own parents. And there's certain things there which are just worth interesting to know. As we're on the concept,
the question is,
yeah.
I was just going to say for him that because that's an interesting aspect within the book about overt signs of affection, because that was definitely not something that you would see in my parents' generation. But the love was there, but it wasn't. It was very subtle when others were there. But obviously, in privacy, we don't know because we never really ask. But you would never see them holding hands, or you never see them, doing those sort of things overtly, whether with family or with strangers. Whereas I think, again, nowadays, that maybe isn't quite the case. So you will see that happening with, again, the children of immigrants and that sort of thing. And I guess it's the case of, obviously, some of us have obviously taken that on board and thought actually that works. But quite clearly for their generation, it wasn't the done thing. But again, there was subtle, and there are still subtle levels of affection that they do show each other. But I guess we don't really perceive it because it's not in your face and it's not obvious. And it's interesting because I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. Why they were kind of in that way, but I guess there's an element of comportment and composure that we kind of don't really have. I guess you would argue.
I guess, it's like even when they're ringing at 8 p.m. every night when he's moved to Ohio on the dot, they have that chat. That's a form of love, isn't it? Really, it's not a PDA, public display of affection, but you can't doubt that's not a form of love that they're expressing, but in their own intimate way between them. You were saying something, Med?
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, thanks for the PDA explanation because I didn't know what you meant anyway, but thanks for that. This is to talk. I was just going to say, I think that, when Zubair talks about, display of affection overtly, openly, it is cultural because, you are brought up to show or not show, display that kind of affection openly. And I know that you mentioned how the children are different. And again, I think that's sort of like the impact of different cultures, isn't it, on the children? Because what was norm for our parents is changing.
Yeah.
And how we display our affection or how we display, sort of our pleasure in lots of different things has changed as well. So I think that's sort of like evolving in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah. Just on that, it's just interesting. I guess from my time, growing up in India, same-sex kind of display of emotion where men would hold each other's hands were perfectly acceptable. But the opposite sex clearly wasn't. And it was just on the basis of potential other people being annoyed or feeling it's as a cause of nuisance. hence it wasn't really done. And it was kind of just one of those taboo things. You never do that. But it's about, I guess, expectation. The overt displays of infections. I don't know whether with subsequent generations, as well as migrating to the West, or I guess the indoctrination of Western ideas. I'm not saying that's happening. Maybe the boundaries are changing, but there's an expectation, and if there is an overt display of infection, if you don't, the two people involved don't see it or feel it, other people will see it, and then they will comment, and subsequently that has a negative effect on something that you're trying to build and trying to forge out. So it's really interesting.
Maybe it is a marriage manual after all. We've talked a bit about marriage on that same tack. Maybe let's move on to death as well. They often go hand in hand, don't they? That's the next rite of passage, so to speak. The next step is death. So, in terms of death, starting with you, Mebs, perhaps, what did you make of how death was dealt with in the book, and what you learned perhaps about death in Hindu culture and in that tradition, perhaps?
Yeah, I've been actually looking at that aspect of some of your discussion points, and I was sort of really racking my brains and thinking, I need to read that book again to sort of really see how much and what was said about some of the rituals around death. And I really struggled, to be perfectly honest. And again, I was thinking about, okay, maybe this is a time where I sort of play my age card and say, I'm sorry, I've forgotten. I don't know what I've read. But I really did. I really struggled. I don't really recall anything that hit me and said, oh, I didn't know about that. And that's really good, because if I compare it to, some of you may have seen the book. Not the book, so the film Around the World in 80 Days, Phileas Fogg sort of stuff. And there, about the Hindu culture and what happens at death and stuff like that. And that's quite vivid, isn't it? And I must have seen that film probably 20, 30 years ago. And I still remember it. And that was missing for me from the book. And again, I don't know whether I've just sleep read it and not picked it up at all. So I held my hand up and said I didn't pick that up.
Okay, Mehran, anything about death that you picked up from the book, or just how we reflect on death in society?
I've already talked about, I think the bit of the book that I thought was very well done was actually around the time when his father passed away. I thought she kind of, to some extent, fed into stereotypes where the daughter comes and sacrifices and looks after the mother, and subsequently is kind of. I'm not saying that because I'm a guy, but both. I guess there's that expectation for children, regardless of gender. But it's interesting that Gogol didn't really have that desire. And once you start doing things out of obligation or necessity, it's almost as though you've lost the battle. But I thought she fed into stereotype a bit about grief. And maybe because of the fact that she was very supportive, she didn't really comment on her subsequent relationship. She was very keen on guiding Gogol in terms of his choice of partners and his relationships. But there's very little given or said to Sonia. So I thought, in terms of father's death was very vivid, but certainly how mom was subsequently supported was quite interesting.
Zubair, what did you make of the way death played out in the book?
Yeah, it's a good point actually, because if you look at the pivotal points within the book, a lot of them do revolve around the people dying. That train journey, that's quite dramatic and very tragic, but that was a pivotal point in the book. His dad passing away was a pivotal point of the book. I would argue his grandma passing away, and hence not sending the name across, was pivotal, because that's where he got the name. Because if she hadn't passed away, then he may well have been called, I don't know, Ashoka or something. So I think that was, for me, I think she, although death is, tragic and has loads of negative connotations in general, she used death, I think, as pivotal points within the book. And so the book pivots around death for me. So every time somebody dies, the book takes another turn, or the book is underpinned by death itself, which I think, for me, that's why I think the book's a bit of a tragedy, because the end scene, the fact that he's alone, and the fact that a lot of the book, the pivotal points around death, as opposed to around birth, around something joyous like moving, I don't know, becoming rich, for example, or getting a scholarship somewhere. It wasn't those things that were pivotal points. It was the deaths that were the most pivotal points for me within the book. I guess you could also argue the breakdown in relationships would also maybe points, but I think the times we thought you could hear the most reflection was when somebody died. That's when you got that's when I understood more of the character. I understood more about Gogol and the family, and about what the author was trying to say around those points. Whereas when there was a marriage taking place, or there was a journey taking place, or there was a party, somebody being born, although those were joyous occasions, you didn't really get the impression that there was a lot of, you couldn't really understand the people as much. But I guess that probably also is reality as well, because sadly when people do die, we do take stock, don't we? And death is very sad and very tragic, but it can also inspire. It can also lead to change, positive and negative, admittedly, but it can do those things. And although those losses are always there, they do obviously cause change. I think for him, though, I think death was a bad thing. I think in general, I think he came off worse from it, because the fact that the train journey, the fact that grandma died, the fact that father died, I think he was worse off for it. And that probably reflects the experience of a lot of people. And I think that for me was what came out of it. So yeah, it's not a marriage guidance book, but it probably has a bit more in terms of death counseling, but not in terms of how to handle death, but actually how somebody dying can be quite negative for somebody.
Yeah, I found the idea of death really interesting. I mean, it talks about the concept of someone expiring, which is in Bengali culture. So I know it says, they've expired. I know my relatives, when they inform me of that from Bangladesh, they will actually write that to me. So and so has expired. And you might, culturally, you may think that's quite interesting when you compare that to British culture. We don't normally, we talk of passed or died, but it is used. I don't know if it's in India, but yeah, definitely. So that was interesting. I think absolutely spot on, Zubair. There were so many deaths, which is why I like to call it the 4 funerals and a wedding book. That's what it's become, really. It's interlocked all the way through the book, and they're pivotal moments. And it's interesting because nowadays in society, we try and promote birthdays and marriages. They're the big times, but actually this book isn't all about birthdays and marriages. It's more about death, and that's what has the biggest things and makes you look at maybe life a bit differently. Instead of always celebrating birth, it's also looking at death as a form of renewal. And he's really renewed himself after the death of his dad. He's really broken off links with his current relationship, taken stock, tried to act like an elder son, I would say, in many ways, taken on board his responsibilities. And really it's hit home that his parents didn't get to be there with their parents when they died. And what was the difference with him? He wasn't there either with his dad when he died either. He wasn't close. He neglected to see him in the weeks leading up to it. And these are difficult things to reconcile in someone, which is when you actually, when you've had opportunities and you didn't take them up, it's too late when you're dead. And I think that's something that comes out of the book. When you're dead, yeah, you're left with the clothes and everything. But if you've not made that opportunity before death, you've had your chance. And I think that came to him quite late on. He's well into his 20s by the time this happens. And really that lack of maturity in him comes through in the book. I know time is short, so I just want to take one more section before we do the actual scores and then move on to the next book. And the last bit, which we just want to cover before we finish on this book, is obviously the concept of identity, because this is a big thing. And I don't just mean about the name, but what does it mean in terms of how identities can shift in terms of integration, assimilation, accommodation, and how identity is explored in the book? Mehran, any brief words on that?
Identity, it's interesting how you use the words assimilation and accommodation. So I guess everyone kind of builds their own personality on a set of, let's just say, blocks of knowledge. And I guess assimilation is where your subsequent experience kind of builds on your foundation, whereas accommodation is where you continue to actually completely change as a person based on that experience. And if I actually reflect on what Jhumpa Lahiri does, I'd probably say she's part of the latter, because she's jumped from one ship to the next, and it's just very much an evolution as opposed to a progressive change that you can perhaps relate with assimilation. So I think in identity is key. Heritage, I think, it's important to, I think it should be important to everyone, because you want to try to preserve the diversity of culture so that it gets passed on from generation to generation. But I guess the key thing is about positivity. There's lots of negativity that exists. And I think we can all relate to some aspects of each other's culture, and to trying to say that, perhaps that's not needed at this day and age. But yeah, that's probably what I'd have to say on those.
Mebs, what did you make of the concept of identity in the book?
Again, I don't know whether I'm sort of like looking at through the eyes that are completely different from you guys, but I think Gogol really struggled as far as his identity was concerned. I think that he was sort of like, part of him was having these relationships because he was searching, because he perhaps felt that maybe I need to just like, I don't know whether these are the right words, but better myself than my parents in way of adapting to my new way of life. And so he tried to sort of like fit into completely different circles, and then sort of like actually did a full circle at the end, where he's been on this journey trying to find himself, and then it's like coming back home saying, well, actually, I've been there and I haven't really found myself. And then, when Zubair, you mentioned about when he's alone at the end with a house full of people, but he's in this room going through the book that his father had left for him, and then finally finds himself. Sad and tragic, but I think that, again, not really enough of his exploration, sort of like some of the questions that I think somebody going through that journey would ask, what is it about my own culture, background, tradition that I'm struggling with? Why is it? Why is that? And I think that, okay, he may not turn to his parents, but he may well turn to his friends, from the same background to have those maybe explorations. So I think it lacks that for me.
Zubair, what did you make of the concept of identity?
Sorry. Yeah, okay. I thought I was saying something. No, fine. Good question. In all fairness, I don't know how Gogol sees himself. As I read through the book, I thought initially felt as though he was quite happy with this role of being a first generation settler, that sort of thing, and just being American. And then he embraced being an American as opposed to being Bengali, and tried to get rid of, and the whole shedding Gogol for Nikhil for me was a nice way to see the whole him shedding his past and becoming this new person. But again, there was this whole element of he's done it, he's met somebody, but then when it came to his parents, it fell apart. Because when dad died, his partner couldn't understand, and therefore there was this, I don't think he was designed that way, but there seemed to be a bit of an issue there between the two. So I think the bridging that generation for him was a challenge for him. Although his parents didn't at any stage say, "Why are you with her?" They just accepted her and invited her in and fed her all those Bengali dishes and stuff. There was an element of he himself struggled to bring her into the fray. So because he didn't bring her into the fray, she felt disenfranchised, didn't feel part of the journey, and therefore she kind of felt upset and felt as though it wasn't right. But also then when she was saying that, well, why are we not going away? Why can't we go away on holiday? And he felt as though he couldn't go along because he had to be there for his family. She couldn't understand that aspect because I don't think he, again, communicated that part to her. I think if he had done that, maybe it might have been a different outcome to the book. But then again, he then reverts back to type, so to speak, and goes for an arranged marriage, if you want to call it that, by his parents, his mum and getting Mushima together and sort of going through that journey. But again, there was an element of, we're both from a Bangladeshi background, but actually we don't eat Bengali food at home, do we? You don't cook, you dress this way, we eat out like this. So although their names they may have culturally been Bengali, in many ways they weren't acting Bengali, if you want to call it that. But thereafter, she kind of veers off in a way, and I don't think he's still. I get the impression towards the end of the book that maybe he wasn't comfortable yet being either Bengali or American. I think he felt as though he's in between both, and he didn't still know what he wanted. And it was a good thing that Mevs mentioned this, because I'd actually picked it up through the book, that maybe because his dad had sat him down and said, this is the way things are, and this is where you culturally come from, but you're here now, so this is what you've got to do. Maybe he suffered because of that. I don't know. But you got the impression that there was something there towards the end where if I read that book as somebody who maybe had the same cultural background as him, I'd be sort of thinking, well, so what do I do? I still don't understand where I sit. What's the optimal Bengali that I need to bring to the fray, and the optimal American that I need to bring to the fray? Because America is a diverse country. There's lots of cultures there. You can have tacos there and be Mexican American. You could be Irish American. You can be German American. You could be all sorts of American. There's nothing wrong being Bengali American, but there wasn't anything there towards the end saying, well, these parts of Bengali culture are okay to be in America, but actually certain aspects maybe don't quite fit in, like Mehran said before, that certain things that don't make sense here, don't use them here. So I think one of my sort of criticism of the book would be that it would be good to see her opinion through Goggle of actually this is the optimal Bengali level in America. So you might not be wearing saris, for example, but you might have this certain kind of cultural sort of value. You may not have the Bengali food that she mentioned in vivid description, but actually the way you eat meals will be with the family. You won't eat it on your own in front of the TV. Those sort of things weren't quite there. And I think that was the difficult part for me. So I think identity-wise, I don't think Goggle realized what his identity was towards the end. And I think it would have been good to get that from her, but it wasn't quite forthcoming.
Mehran, you were going to say something, Mehran?
To be honest, Fahim, I've completely forgotten. I just let Zubair carry on. But it's, I do, when we think about the title of the book, Namesake, I'm going to change the script a little bit here. How many of you guys are happy with your name, and have you thought about changing it?
I love my name. Happy with it.
Same here, Behrad.
What about you, man?
Sorry, dude.
Yeah, well, obviously, this is my nickname, Mebs, and it's not because I wasn't happy with my name at all. It never occurred to me to change my, have a nickname and change my name at all. It's something that actually was shouted on a football pitch by somebody who had a speech impediment, and it stuck, and it was the name that the only name he could pronounce, really, and the unfortunate thing about it is that the poor guy died a couple of years later, so I kept it. Yeah, but no, I'm very proud to have the name that my parents chose. But this is. I mean, again, it's sort of like a working name. At work, I've been known with that name, but at home, it's back to Mahmood.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting because I do know quite a few people who actually don't like their name, but they've continued. Obviously, they're not part of this conversation, and I'm not part of that conversation either. But it's just interesting to what steps Gogol went, and to how he chose an anglicized name. And I do know culturally that there are individuals who are using anglicized versions of Arabic names, etc., and everyone's got a slightly different opinion. But as long as they're happy, that's personally, that's all I think is important. I know that.
But think, so sorry to interrupt, but do you not think that it goes back to what I said earlier about perhaps that conversation between father and son, because he really didn't understand why he's got this name, and that seems to come quite clear in the book, doesn't it? Because that was lacking, wasn't it? He never understood. It's a Russian name. He's Bengali Indian, or such like from Bengali in India. How come he's got this name? And I don't think there was enough effort made to perhaps explain that to him.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think there was, as I said earlier, I was just waiting for that conversation, but it just never came. But, in terms of having additional names, I have a nickname at home, Mamanu, that was given by my granddad, and everyone's just, even my cousins in America, India, and everyone rarely use Mehran. They use my own nickname. And I'm comfortable with that, but I guess it's the concept of discovery, identity, which Gogol really struggled with.
Sure.
Yeah. In terms of identity, I thought there were so many things to explore, obviously, not just his name, but he does go to excessive lengths to really change that, and thinks changing his name will give him a new identity like a superhero, but it doesn't really work out that way. And real life is much more sobering, isn't it? And he's still got the bills to pay, which looks like his parents pay for him, doesn't it? So he hasn't really grown up then either, even when he's got a job. So it was interesting. He sort of wanted the best of both worlds. He was okay with his parents picking up the checks for when he couldn't manage it, but he wanted the Americanized lifestyle of picking his own marriage partner and everything else. And sometimes it's like having your cake and your cherry with it when you have these sort of a dichotomous life, when you actually want a bit of everything. What are you left with? Then you need something like sobering, like a death, to really think, well, who am I again? And it's really interesting, and it's a puzzle. I don't think I've even worked it out by the end of the book. What is his identity? Because the book never really talks about Bengali American as a construct. It talks about these are their American friends, these are their Bengali friends. Where is that bridge of where we have British Bangladeshi or British Indian, British Pakistani, for instance? There isn't that seemingly concept, even though we know that Italian Americans and so on, they all exist. But it looked like the author, for whatever reason, didn't want to actually put Bengali and American even with a truncation at any time in the book. I thought, and sometimes things are conspicuous by their absence. And in that way, I found that was an interesting thing. And also just about in terms of the way they sometimes described his mother after his dad's death, it was describing his mother. Well, when it was referring to his sister doing something, it's, if anything, it should be their mother. But it was a deliberate crafted ploy in the book where at times they were really trying to show that he was trying to acknowledge his mother, even though, like you said, Mehran, it seemed like his sister was doing some gender prescribed roles about coming back into the house. So the concept of identity was fluid. It's not one of those books that talks about LGBT. I think it's fair to say there's only one option where it talks about Maxine and he says she's called Max and she goes, that's a boy's name. So it doesn't look at LGBT in a favorable way or with any understanding. And I don't think it's a book for those sort of times. So in terms of identity, it's a very black and white sort of biological gender sort of way of looking at identities, and maybe less so in terms of what it means to be actually Indian in America as opposed to Bengali, because at times I was getting confused with the Indian part of his identity and his Bengali part of his identity. So that was interesting. We're really at the end. So guys, I just want your final scores. Then Zubair, you introduced the new book for us. Yeah. So Mehran, score out of 5.
I started this conversation with a 3. And then I thought it's actually better than 3. So I'm going to go with 3.5.
Mebs, what would you give it?
Well, last time we spoke, I think I gave it 4, but I've gone through some of the discussion points beforehand, and it's dropped down to 3 for me.
Okay. One up, one down. This is interesting. Wasn't expecting that. Zubair, what would you give it?
I won't surprise you for him. I'll stick with my 3. Lovely book to read. As with any book, some parts of which really inspire, educate, intrigue, but parts where maybe you think could do with more embellishment and more explanation. But thank you for bringing it to our lives. I will bring in a book, if that's okay, for next time.
Hang on. We need Fahim's score here.
I'll give you a mark.
Sorry.
Apologies.
They said to me to use the book for next time. Apologies.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I mean,
go ahead.
this is one of those. I mean, it's all arbitrary, but I think I'm just going to stick with 4 for this, and just simply because it brings a lot. You know, it's hard to knock a Pulitzer Prize winner. I'm not going to be the guy who does that, so I'm going to stick with the status quo and give her a 4. Zubair, the next book for next time.
Sorry, yes. So the next book is from somebody from the other side of the subcontinent, if you could call it that, a chap called Mohsin Hamid, who has written a book which Barack Obama was quite fond of, and has said it was one of his reading list. Came out in 2017. It's called Exit West. And it's a book about, well, I guess you find out about it next month. We're hopefully reviewing it on the 27th of September, I believe, which is a Sunday at 8 p.m. I think the day before it's being reviewed by another book club in America, so that should be interesting. Might log on to that too. But apparently there were discussions to make this into a movie at some stage. So it's not a movie yet. I know that was one of your questions that we didn't quite cover. But there are talks to make this into a movie. So hopefully we could do the book club before the movie's made, and then maybe watch the movie then after, once it's been produced. So excellent. Exit West.
Exit West. So I'm looking forward to that. As Zubair mentions, there is a film of The Namesake, which I thoroughly enjoyed. If you look on Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb, it's got massive score ratings and it's critically acclaimed, and I thoroughly recommend it. We have gone over, but maybe that's testimony to the book. We tend to actually, there was a lot to talk about and there were many points we just didn't get time to cover, but the evening grows late. So my thanks to Mehran, Zubair and Mebs as the guests tonight, and maybe we can look forward to seeing you come again if we haven't put you off tonight. Thank you and good evening to everyone.
Thanks for having me.